Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome to Vermont House Judiciary Committee. And we are continuing our consideration on H 629, an act relating to access to adoption records.
This is What Next, the Adoptee Rights Podcast. I'm Gregory Luce, the Executive Director of Adoptees United and an adoptee rights lawyer. In each episode, we talk about the state of adoptee rights around the world. We feature legislative updates, interviews, legal developments, and the frequent absurdities and complications of being an adopted person in the United States or wherever you are.
Good afternoon. Thank you.
My name is Rebekah Dragon, and I'm a registered voter in the state of Vermont. I'm also an adoptee. I want to thank you for allowing this adoptee and the other adoptees that are here to show up on your doorstep today.
This is Vermont, and specifically its testimony from Rebekah Dragon against House Bill 629. There have been at least 3 hearings on the bill so far, and because of the incredible efforts and organizing of local advocates, that bill is now being turned around and redrafted as we speak. It's become this way because of the efforts of 4 adoptee rights advocates in Vermont who came together to form the Vermont Adoptee Rights Working Group and to work together as part of the New England Adoptee Rights Coalition. Here's Ellie Lane, a Vermont adoptee, describing in her testimony what she had to go through under current Vermont law.
Good afternoon. Welcome.
Good afternoon. My name is Ellie Lane, and I live in Braintree. And thank you, Madam Chair, for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today. I've watched all of your committee meetings on this bill intently, and I'm really pleased to be able to share my experience using the registry to access information in the hope that sheds some more light on this issue before you. I am a Vermont adoptee. I was born here in 1987. I was placed for adoption with the Vermont Children's Aid Society, and I was placed with my adoptive parents here in Vermont when I was 3 weeks old. I used the Vermont Adoption Registry to access identifying information as well as my original birth certificate. And I want to share a little bit about that process with you. To begin with, the adoptee consent form is not available on the website. In order to obtain that form, you have to reach out and request it.
Okay, let's back up a bit. Current Vermont law is complicated for an adopted person if you want to get your own original birth record. It uses the state's adoption registry, which Ellie refers to here, and which is overseen by an employee of the state's largest and most prominent adoption agency, whom Ellie refers to here as Ms. Schuma. What you get also depends on when you are adopted, whether a birth parent consents to release information, and also whether a birth parent decides to veto the disclosure of any information, including your own birth record. Here's Ellie describing that process to the committee as she went through it.
I've requested that form several times over the years. I've contacted Ms. Schuma several times before I ever submitted that form. I was really hesitant to submit it because I didn't know what I would find. It was a deeply personal and reflective process for me to decide that I was ready to learn whatever information was available, even if it wasn't what I hoped, and also to weigh what I might do with any information that I did receive. It was the 5th copy of the form that I filled out that I finally had notarized when I was 32. After I submitted that form, I did not receive a response. If I had not inquired more than a month later to confirm its receipt, I'm not sure I would have ever known if it had made it. The response that I did receive was that it might take a while to go through the process of hearing back from the probate court, and that was certainly true. It was more than a year after I submitted the request before I received any information about my adoption. What I did receive did not include my original birth certificate. It did include the names of my birth parents, their last known contact information, health history forms that were completed by my birth mother, and some non-identifying information describing my birth parents, like their height and their hair color and their eye color and the number of siblings that they had. After I received this identifying information, I had to contact Ms. Schuma at the registry again and request that a letter that said that I was eligible to receive my original birth certificate be sent to me. After I received that letter, I had to submit that letter along with another form and a copy of my driver's license to the Department of Health to request my original birth certificate. That came a few weeks later. By the time I received it, I already knew every piece of information on that record. It was still important for me to have. The actual birth certificate that I did receive was a poor photocopy printed on plain white paper with a large dark watermark over the top. It contains my name at birth, the details of my birth, including the actual time I was born and the hospital I was born at, my birth parents' names, their ages, but not birth dates, and a P.O. box for my birth mother from 33 years before. The record offered significantly less information about my biological parents than the identifying information that I received from the registry and the information I already had. And it offered no information that would have helped me contact them if I wanted to. Access to these original birth records is a separate issue from search and reunion. And unrestricted access to these vital records would do little to contribute to adoptees showing up on people's doorsteps, which we don't do, but would go a long way towards ensuring our dignity and restoring our basic rights. By contrast, I lost my amended birth certificate several years ago during a move. In order to obtain that vital record, I went online, I filled out a form, I paid $12, and I had a certified copy in hand a few weeks later. It is critical that any new process here treat all adoptees the same, regardless of when they were born or adopted. The current system is unfair to many, including families with siblings whose adoption dates straddle the arbitrary line in the law, like mine. The current system is poorly designed. It requires us to jump through too many hoops and wait way too long for access to records that all other Vermont-born adults have access to. I ask that you change course here and amend this bill or create a new one to remove all restrictions placed on adoptees in the process of requesting their original birth certificate and provide that access through the same channels as all non-adopted Vermont-born citizens have available to them.
So Ellie laid out the process of what she went through, and she was actually the second adopted person to testify before the committee, other than myself the day before. Rebekah Dragon, another adoptee and a resident of Vermont, teed it up for Ellie and essentially called attention to the lack of adoptee voices so far in consideration of H629, the bill before the committee. Here's what she said.
I encourage you to appreciate the amount of emotional labor that goes into adopted persons speaking before a legislative body, asking simply to be treated with equity under the law. My personal goal is to help you reframe your perspective and your questions so that any further work you do on this bill or any subsequent bill will fully center the civil rights of the primary marginalized party in adoption, the adoptee. H629, as it exists now, aims to allow Vermont-born adoptees some access to their original birth certificates. Vermont is one of the very last states in New England holding out on antiquated laws that bar adoptees from access to their own vital record. This effort gives adoptees transparency and access to their own original documentation, and it's laudable. However, in this proposed legislation, you have included dehumanizing and infantilizing caveats that would further marginalize adoptees and deprive them of equity in the eyes of the law. What other adult citizen of Vermont is subjected to the restriction of access to their own identity and documentation, either by the state or at the hands of someone else because they share DNA? In the course of your discussions, I've heard the argument that, quote, the privacy of the birth mother and birth family must be protected, most notably from the presumed horror of having rogue adoptees, quote, showing up at doors, demanding connection and causing, quote, disruption. This false conflation of privacy and secrecy is a relic of desperately outdated thinking about adoption from an era when doctors promoted smoking cigarettes for good health. First, I would ask to see evidence that quantifies the claim that complete unfettered access to original birth certificates has caused a harmful increase in adoptees showing up on the doorsteps of their biological families unwanted. The majority of New England states and New York have given complete access without restriction, so this outcome could easily be studied. Is it appropriate to create legislation to prevent something that has not been studied and quantified or even identified if it exists? This bill allows for suppression of the record in cases where the birth parent or birth sibling, if the birth parent is dead, so wishes it. No one has a right to secrecy, especially when the secret is so deep that it would make another living person, the adoptee, a secret even to themselves. However, in domestic adoption, secrecy is impossible. All a domestic adoptee needs is a DNA test, a fifth cousin match, and a skilled search angel, and they can find their biological relatives so they can show up at their door. That's how I showed up at the door of my own biological family. Well, in truth, I showed up in the Ancestry.com inbox of my biological uncle, and he was my DNA match there, and I respectfully introduced myself. Think about that as it relates to secrecy. My first point of contact was my uncle, not my biological mother or father. Although I believe the question of whether adoptees should have equal access to their own birth records, it should be completely separated from the question of reunion. I've heard it spoken enough in your discussions, and I'd like to address it. In an era of widespread DNA testing, if you really wanted to protect privacy, it should be imperative to release the original birth record without restriction directly to the adoptee without adding multiple intervening parties. I've watched thousands of adoptees use DNA matching to find their first parents, contacting third and fourth cousins. Eventually, they narrow their search down, they get closer to the goal, and often by the time they finally identify their biological parent, contact with dozens of relatives has been made. And the birth parent is often the last to know that their secret is out and looking for them. Would you add a clause in this legislation to prevent adoptees from taking DNA tests, to protect the dubious privacy of biological families? Or perhaps you could consider legislation that prevents all unwanted solicitation at doors, for instance, from religious proselytizers and political canvassers. The answer to an unwanted person at your door or in your inbox or your voicemail is to ask them to never contact you again. If they contact despite your wishes, you can issue them a cease and desist or a no contact order. When you start with the assumption that there can be, quote, harm in adoptees contacting their own biological relatives, and that biological families need, quote, protection from the potential of, quote, disruption, you are inferring something incredibly unfair about adoptees, that they pose a potential risk, that they are a danger, and that the only way to protect others from them is through the preservation or creation of preemptive codified laws that restrict their rights and treat them differently than other citizens. The matter of sealed vital records and the adult adoptee is not a matter to be decided between the adoptee and their biological or adoptive relatives. It is a matter between the adoptee and the state. Statutes are not promises. They can and they should change when they actively marginalize any group of people based on the mere circumstance of their existence. There is ample legislation from past years that we would be railing against if these laws were still valid, laws that would determine what races and genders are allowed to marry, laws that set tax rates that we no longer adhere to, and laws that would prohibit opening your business on a Sunday. I implore this committee to reconsider how this proposed legislation, with power given to biological relatives to deny adoptees access to their own vital record, is a great indignity to the adoptee. Adoptees deserve legal autonomy and full and complete access to their own records, just like all other Vermont citizens. Please consider a clean bill that would give Vermont adoptees access to their original birth certificates in the same way that any other citizen of the state is able to access theirs, through the Department of Health for a nominal fee.
A clean bill. That's what we're hopefully going to get, and likely this week. And how did we get to where we had two bad bills, one in the Senate, one in the House, to turn around the House bill and to effectively have it rewritten so that it provides an unrestricted right of adult adopted people to request and obtain their birth record. Well, we have to back up a bit more and talk about the formation of the New England Adoptee Rights Coalition, but more importantly, the formation of the Vermont Adoptee Rights Working Group. I spoke to Rebekah Henson, Mary Anna King, and Ellie Lane about that. Go ahead.
Quick housekeeping question: Do we want to just drop the working group part from Vermont Adoptee Rights?
It's up to you guys. Yeah.
Vermont Adoptee Rights. I just throwing that out there for.
I mean, if maybe you can think of like a longer one where it spells out varmint. That'd be kind of cool.
Yeah. Those crazy adoptee varmints.
Yeah, exactly.
What are those whippersnappers up to?
So, Becca, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about how you got into the space of legislation?
Goodness, how much time do you have? So yes, I'm Rebekah Henson. I've been involved in adoptee rights advocacy for something like 20 years now. I first learned about adoptee rights, just the concept in general, when I was in high school, and had some trouble getting a non-driver ID. They wouldn't accept my amended birth certificate on its own, and said that they needed the original birth certificate in addition to the amended one, because I think there was like a piece of information missing from the amended birth certificate. I think for a while New Jersey didn't include the birthplace on the amended birth certificate, even if it was in the original. And I think that was the kind of the identifier that they do now. They've changed that within the last few years. Yeah, I think it was some like minor piece of information that's on everyone else's birth certificate that wasn't on my amended one. So they required me to submit the original birth record in addition to the amended one in order to prove my identity to get a non-driver photo ID. And my adoptive mom had to explain that that's impossible. I'm adopted, so we don't actually have access to that document, and they didn't understand how or why that could be. And we actually had to end up shelling out the like $150 or whatever it was at the time to get a passport that I could use as photo identification. So I had to, I was paying an adoptee tax essentially, just to get the basic photo identification.
So the federal government would take your birth certificate, but your state of New Jersey would not. Yeah, didn't have any
problems with that.
You're kind of an old timer. You're like, you've been involved for, and it's funny. I've met so many people so far on this podcast that have been involved for 20 or more years. And yet here you are now in Vermont. So fast forward to Vermont. And how long have you been in Vermont?
I've been in Vermont since 2016. I grew up in South Jersey, moved to Philadelphia after college, lived there until 2016, and then moved to Vermont.
So I mean, it's surprising. Vermont's such a small state, and I'm sure in the top 10 of least populated states in the country, and yet
third oldest population.
Really,
Mm-hmm.
And yet here's 4 Vermont connected adopted people: you, Mary, Ellie, and Rebekah, working on a bill, which I don't often see such 4 dedicated people in one state, and here you are in one of the smallest states in the country working to turn around a bill. And so I think it's really remarkable. It's really wild. It's super cool. But how did and maybe we'll bring in Ellie and Mary as well, but I remember talking to you a couple of years ago about a bill, and it could have been another way around. You said, hey, there's this bill in Vermont. What do you want to do about it? And then another bill came out, and that was the study bill last year. And so we kicked around the idea of the New England Adoptee Rights Coalition. Didn't really go anywhere at the point. There's nothing really to do. It was a study bill.
Yeah, and the bill didn't go anywhere either.
Yeah, I know. And it was pretty clear it wasn't going anywhere. But then suddenly this year, we have 2 bills in Vermont. One's in the Senate, which is a terrible bill. And then one now in the House is what we'll be talking about. So tell me about how did you know Ellie? And obviously, I know that Mary's your sister, so you obviously knew her, which I didn't know you were sisters. And I know Mary has a book about that her whole ordeal. But how did you get in touch with Ellie and Rebekah and Mary, and sort of all four of you figure out let's do something?
Our conversation about the House and Senate bills happened back in January. It was short. You reached out to me shortly after the new year, when Vermont's legislative session started, and said, "Hey, there's 2 new bills." I really wasn't expecting, like, based on the 2 previous years that a bill had been introduced around adoptees' rights to access our own birth records. Like nothing happened with those other 2 bills. Like they got introduced, they got referred to committee, and the committee never took them up. And I wasn't expecting, I wasn't expecting like sudden movement on either of these bills. And I also, like, honestly, I really wasn't expecting any movement on either of those bills. So like I was in a mind frame of, well, I guess we'll just keep an eye on it and see what happens. And then I think it was like 2 weeks later was when we found out that it was scheduled for a hearing in the committee. And that's what that's when I kind of went into hyperdrive action to see if there was any other if there were any other adoptees that I could connect with in Vermont to try to submit testimony and to the committee and have an opportunity to speak with the committee members.
And did you already know Ellie?
No. I reached out to Courtney Dobson on Twitter, because she is closely connected with Rebekah Dragon. I had communicated with Rebekah Dragon a few times in the past, but didn't really have like much of a relationship with her. And I knew she had taken a step back from some of the advocacy work she had been doing. And I wasn't sure if that extended to legislative stuff or if it was just like the educational materials that she works on. I wasn't sure kind of where she was on all from like her sabbatical from all that. So I reached out to Courtney to see if she could facilitate, getting me in touch with Rebekah Dragon, so that because I knew she lived in Vermont as well, and she was besides Mary, she's the only other Vermont adoptee who I knew about. And like I can't even like really say that I knew her. Like I knew about her, but like I didn't really know her before.
And I'd forgotten that she's in Vermont. She's a fellow District of Columbia adoptee along with me, but I hadn't realized that she kind of goes back and forth between Massachusetts and Vermont, but has a place in Vermont as well. Yeah.
Yeah, she's like right on the state border there.
Right.
But yeah, so I reached out to Rebekah Dragon and asked if she wanted to be involved in any way, if she had the bandwidth to help out, and she was absolutely 100% on board. And I was like looped her into the conversation I was having with you, and I think Ellie had reached out to you.
Is that really?
And you put her in touch with.
Oh, I don't remember that.
Me and Rebekah.
So
I think was how let
me talk to Ellie real quick. So Ellie, if you could introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about who you are and how you got to where you are today, working in the legislation on adoptee rights.
Sure. Yeah, my name's Ellie Lane, and I am a Vermonter. I was born here, adopted here, raised here. I left for college and came back. And through my work at the Commission on Women, I follow legislation actively during the session. And I've been watching what's been happening, the bills that have been introduced in Vermont for the last couple of years, but also didn't expect them to go anywhere. So when I saw this bill was being scheduled for hearings, I reached out to you, Greg, by email to see if you were planning on testifying. I am pretty new to the adoptee rights advocacy work, but I had attended a webinar of yours like a year ago, and so had it in the back of my mind that you were out there working on these things, and so just sent you an email and hoped that you might be able to offer some written testimony, and found out you were already engaged and working on it, and then you looped me in.
Oh, good. Well, I forgot that that's how it happened, actually. Which is, it all seems so fortuitous in some ways. I mean, you just sort of get connected and then you find the right people. And I think we did find the right people. And then at some point there was this kind of a organization called it's loosely an organization called New England Adoptee Rights Coalition, but it was sort of a shell of a coalition that was intended to grow. And then this was a perfect opportunity to form a state group, the Vermont Adoptee Rights Working Group, that then became part of the coalition. And so I think that's what's so cool about what's happened. And this all happened it feels like it's been 6 months, but I think it's less than a month at this point.
Yeah,
maybe it's a little bit more than a month.
I think Ellie and Rebekah Dragon joined up in that first week.
Right.
And then I think it was the day after that first committee meeting that Mary texted me to ask if I was doing anything about this Vermont bill.
Right.
I was actually drafting up an email to her to fill her in on some of the details that had been happening so far, just as she texted me. So that's how I brought Mary in. I was like, oh yes.
And then Mary, could you introduce yourself and say a little bit about who you are?
Yes, I'm Mariana King. I am a kinship adoptee, and I am Rebekah Henson's biological sister. We're full biological sisters. Adoption has been a part of my life for as long as I can remember, because I lived with my first parents when they were placing my younger sisters for adoption. So I was their second oldest. They had 7 children. And my brother and I were living with our parents when they were pregnant and deciding to place our sisters for adoption. So I remember meeting my sister's prospective adoptive parents when I was, some of my earliest memories are of meeting their parents. And we were very, of course, we didn't have a lot economically. We were, very poor. My first mother had run away from home when she was 17, and she hadn't finished high school. She got married very early, and nobody thought that she should be allowed to have her children. At every point when we ran into difficulties and she wanted to keep my sisters, everyone told her, well, I can help you find someone to take this baby. That was their way to help. That was the only help that I remember anybody offering. I don't remember anybody saying, you can do this and I will help you. When I was 7, I was sent to Oklahoma from New Jersey, where I was born, to live with my grandfather and his second wife, who I'd met once or twice before, because my first parents were getting a divorce and neither one of them could afford to keep my brother and sister and I together. And so in order to keep us all together, they sent us to Oklahoma. And when I was 10, my grandfather and step-grandmother adopted me. So I remember that's when I became familiar with original birth certificates, because I saw my documentation change in front of me. The day I was adopted, I went to the Social Security office and signed my new Social Security card with my new name. And I saw my new birth certificate with my adoptive parents listed where my birth parents' names had been.
At age 10?
At age 10, yeah. So I thought at that point, I thought it was really strange. It kind of made me giggle a little bit, because I thought, oh, on this, it shows that my mother is in her 60s. That's really like, what are my descendants going to think because my adoptive mother was very into genealogy. So I was really familiar. This was in the 90s, but I was already kind of into genealogy because of her. And I remember thinking, what is like a great great granddaughter going to think when she comes across my birth certificate and thinks, wait a minute, this mother is 62 years old. Is this a medical miracle? So that was when I first realized about the documentation. I didn't really become super involved in adoptee rights until I started writing my memoir, which is about Rebekah's and my sort of family journey of how we all got split up and how we found each other again. Spoiler alert. And that was around early 2010s, like around 2011, 2012. I started reading a lot of other books about adoption. I think I started with Betty Jean Lifton, Twice Born, and then that goes naturally to Nancy Verrier, Primal Wound. I read Ann Fessler, The Girls Who Went Away, and I think the one that shocked me the most was when I came across Catherine Joyce's The Child Catchers.
Yeah, it's a great book.
That book.
I'm thinking about that a lot today, actually. Yeah, with Ukraine and
Yes, of course. I just, it blew my mind. And that was when I thought, this is insane, the way we treat the truth that's written on paper versus the truth of our lived experience. I always thought that was wild, that there's so much effort thrown after creating this paper trail to make something seem real when it doesn't necessarily reflect how we experience our families and how we experience our own identity as adopted people.
What's the name of your book?
Moved. Yeah, absolutely.
No, I'll put it in the show notes. But what's the name of your book? I remember it's Bastards, right? Or
it's called Bastards.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right. Which I love.
It was great. Published in 2015. I had some arm wrestling with my editor and
about
my publisher.
Naming it that?
Yeah, they wanted to name it "Finding My Sisters."
Oh, of course. I mean,
which. Yeah, I hate it.
I know.
Title.
They're probably 3/4 of the memoirs are kind of, forced into that kind of title. Yeah.
Yeah, it might have sold more if I named it that, but
probably true. Yeah. I'm glad you stuck to your guns and just named Bastards. That's a great name for a great title.
For me, it was about the reality versus the counterfeit. It wasn't so much about the tradition, the old school definition of legitimacy, like who's your father. It was more the idea of this counterfeit, sort of the secondary definition of bastard, like
right.
a knockoff version. And I talk about that in the book. It was in the manuscript, and I really was committed to preserving that. But the book came out in 2015. And actually, all the siblings came out to Los Angeles, where I was living at that point, for the book launch. It's the only time we've ever all been in the same place at the same time.
So all seven?
All seven. Yeah. All seven. It was wild. We're not accustomed to being that large a group ever. So it's sometimes hard to remember how many seatbelts you need in vehicles.
Right. There's only so many automobiles that you can have.
Lots of money on extra long Ubers.
Yeah.
Right. You're like, oh, we need to get an SUV.
Right.
So that was a blast. That was amazing. And then I moved to Vermont in 2019.
So not too long ago. Yeah.
Not too long ago. Luckily, before the pandemic, and my partner and I felt a fair amount of survivor's guilt after we left LA, and we happened to be in Vermont during the pandemic. It was just like, oh, yeah, we got out.
Right, exactly.
But with this bill, I do remember, I think I encountered some of your tweets about it. Adoptee Twitter is kind of where I get a lot of my information.
Same.
And Rebekah is very active.
Yep.
She's my kind of guru on adoptee rights information and what's happening. And I watched the first committee hearing. And that's when I texted her and I said, hey, are you planning to write testimony? Because that was the only option at that point, was they were only accepting written testimony from people. And I think I said something like, hey kids, what's your plan? What are we doing here? And then it turned out there was this coalition being built, and
it really
I got to be a part of it.
It was really a whirlwind. Yeah, it really was, because there's so much happening at once. We thought, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, we thought this was the only chance that they're ever going to hear anything about this bill, and they're only hearing from an adoption attorney, the registry facilitator, and legislative counsel. And we thought, there it goes. I mean, we're not going to change anything.
Yeah, it felt very much like we have to write a lot and write it quickly so we can jam our foot in the door before this closes. Right. I remember that feeling very distinctly.
Yeah, that's very much the sense that I had too. That's why, like, as soon as I saw that as soon as I saw that hearing on the schedule, my first impulse was, all right, who else do I know who can jump in, get involved,
right,
lobby for this. And I didn't even know that Rebekah Dragon has such a this is literally her career in local politics. I had no idea that was her background. So that was it feels like so much of this kind of came together as the universe pulling some strings to to just bring the right people together at the right time is very much what it feels like. But yeah, there was that urgency of not wanting this bill to advance without the committee hearing from the people who are actually impacted. And I think what really got to me, especially from that first committee hearing, was how many times both the registry director they had and the legislative counsel who was also talking about the bill, and trying to answer questions about, well, how does this work now? How do adopted people get their birth certificates now? And she admitted that, I really don't know how any of this works. I'm not familiar with this part of the law. And I was like, wait, this is your legislative counsel. This is not, you have her working on a bill that she's not even familiar with how this works. What? And that really got you. They were hearing from people on that first day who were openly admitting, I think both of them admitted it at least one point in that conversation, that they were not the best person to speak to the questions that were being asked. And hearing both of them say that, just really that really stirred something inside me.
I think in all of us. I think that's what motivated all of us to really dig in. And little do we know that unlike almost every legislature I've done work in, they have multiple hearings in which they're gathering information on. And so I think then there's one next week. It'll probably air the day after this podcast, but they're going to walk through a new bill based upon all four of you pushing to be heard, essentially. And boy, were you heard. I mean, you came out really powerfully in the hearings when they heard from people who are impacted by this, especially Ellie, who's the actual Vermont adopted person who's going to be impacted by this the most. But yeah, that was pretty crazy.
I think something that's really worked with this group coming together is that we're all really passionate, and I think, and we've all been pretty well versed in at least some corner of adoptee rights, and the patterns of adoptee experience. So as we're sitting there listening to these committee discussions, we're thinking, ooh, we're like Hermione in a Harry Potter novel, like, I know the answer, call on me, pick me. So we were all really prepared, and I think we all really support one another a lot. In the first meeting where we all four got together and we were talking about the structure of the working group, it was really clear that Ellie needed to be the spokesperson, and she really needed to take the lead. Her experience as a Vermont adoptee and having gone through the registry system was so relevant and so important for this committee to hear.
Right. And Ellie, is that a role that you even expected that you would be doing, is sort of being the spokesperson for this adoptee rights group on a bill that's in your state of birth, and actually in many ways turning that bill around? Did you ever expect to be in where you are right now?
No, I absolutely did not expect to be in this role, and certainly not in this time frame. I feel like this has moved so fast, and it's been a bit of a whirlwind, but I'm so happy to be able to share my experience and have that make an impact. And the group that we have formed, I think, is very powerful, and we have very complementary skills, and it's so exciting to watch sort of how that can come together and feel like we're really shifting what's happening with this bill.
Yeah, I mean, and and we've got, hopefully I'll play this in part of the podcast, that some of the, after you all testified, and Rebekah, I think we've talked about this before, the statements from the legislators were just mind-blowing, especially Representative Burdett, and I'll play that one. But others who say, they finally get it. And on a very, very fundamental level, like Burdett saying, it's my birth certificate, it should be mine. And then, just a very basic level. None of the other stuff, the whataboutisms and what about this or what about that. No, it's just, it's a document, it's mine.
Yeah, and that he supports opening records for adopted people. He said, barring any other testimony that's going to blow me out of the water.
Right.
And,
exactly.
And based on his response at the hearing after that, where we had Claudia Corrigan. Claudia Corrigan Darcy. Did she go by author?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
I get a little fuzzy sometimes on who's going by which names. It seems to shift around sometimes in the community. But so we had Claudia Corrigan Darcy, Annette O'Connell, and Roberta Beavers, and testifying after the next meeting after we did, and they took it. It wasn't quite a vote, but they did kind of, the chair asked for input from the rest of the committee after that discussion, and Representative Burdett basically kind of doubled down on, I'm convinced that does it for me. Like, I don't need to hear anything else. This is, I'm exactly where I was the last time we talked about this, just totally convinced, totally over that line. It was amazing for me to see the incredible shift from that first meeting, where right out of the gate, after the bill's main sponsor gave her introduction on, this is why I want to introduce this bill. The very, very first question from one of the other committee members, like within 30 seconds of the meeting starting, was, so I want to know just how the very first, my first concern is, how do we make sure that we can stop people from just showing up on someone's doorstep unwanted?
Right.
How do we make sure that people don't do that?
Right.
It's like, well,
exactly. Yeah.
I mean, that's, first of all, it's not a thing. it just doesn't happen. But seeing that, like, that being the very first knee-jerk response, like not even 30 seconds into the meeting, that's the very first thing that came up. Going from that to, like, 2 weeks later, all but two of the committee members being totally on board for clean legislation that would just give unrestricted access for adoptees to get their birth certificates. Like, that was such an amazing, a quick and amazing turnaround. I really did not expect such an overwhelmingly positive response to the testimony that we gave. Seeing seeing the impact that had, and the way seeing how deeply it resonated and connected with so many of those committee members was, I don't think I've experienced anything like that before.
The closest I've ever seen
anything.
is in New York, was when legislators who were adopted themselves would stand up and talk about that on the floor of the assembly. But nothing like what's happened here. I mean, I don't know of one bill that has turned around from being discriminatory to unrestricted. We're not there yet. I mean, we haven't seen the bill. We haven't seen whatever they're drafting, and it's a long, long way to go still to get through the House, the full House, and then also the Senate. And I'm wondering what you all think. Are you optimistic? Are you pessimistic? Are you sort of in between? I mean, it sounds like we may have a victory here in one committee, but what do you think is going to happen? And Ellie, you may have a really good idea on this because you work, in the legislative arena every day through your job. But how hard is it going to be to go forward?
Cautiously optimistic.
Cautiously optimistic.
That's kind of my default state anyway, but the comments that we heard are really inspiring for me, and I feel like there's a real possibility that we could move a clean bill out of this committee. And once that happens, I think that getting it through the full House will be a challenge, but I think it's doable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the part I just don't know. I mean, you have experience there, and you never know. I did hear today, and this won't go on the podcast, but right before this, I got a response from Representative Grad to my email explaining to answering her questions, and she said that she's already talked to Senator Sears, and he wants to see it come out of committee. So
that's fantastic.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh!
So I'll forward that.
Exciting.
I'll forward that to you.
So exciting. That's going to make a difference.
That's very exciting.
Yeah, and he's adopted too. So
yes,
that's right. Yeah.
In Massachusetts. So, and he's had, I don't know if this is public or not, but he's been denied his original birth certificate twice in Massachusetts. So there's some lived experience right there. Yeah. So yeah, I think would you, Rebekah and Mary, would you call yourselves cautiously optimistic?
I would say, yeah, I'm with Ellie on the cautious optimism. I'm very inspired and very, very heartened by the response that we've seen from this House committee. I'm nervous about attitudes that we might encounter from the rest of the legislature at large.
Right.
I think there's a lot of there's a lot of hearts and minds that probably need some educating and changing to get it to fully pass. And then there's the Senate Judiciary Committee, which it'll get passed on to if and when it passes the House. And so because there are at least two additional obstacles to overcome with getting people on board with this issue as the civil rights issue that it is, and being able to decouple a lot of the stereotypes and the ideas of adopted people only want this document so that they can hunt down and track down their birth parents and surprise them and take them off guard by showing up on their doorstep and all that kind of stuff. Like we're sleuths. That's a word that came up with the committee a number of times, referring to adopted people as sleuthing for information. And wow. It's like that's not what it'd be like.
Right.
I was in reunion with my siblings and my biological parents for I think it was 12 years by the time I was finally given the right to access my original birth certificate in the state of New Jersey. And I still want it because it's mine. It's my birth certificate, and everyone else has the legal right to access theirs, and I want to exercise that right myself. Like it's the same for me as when the day I turned 18, the first thing I did on my 18th birthday, opened a bank account and registered to vote, because I'm 18 and that's my right to do that now. Right. And I want my birth certificate for the same reason.
Yeah.
I have the right to access it just like everyone else, finally. And as of 2017, and I want to exercise that right because I can, because I couldn't before, and now I can. And that's what it's come down to for me. So getting people to like to see that and realize that it's not about hunting people down. It's not about tracking people and surprising them and with a life-ruining secret and exposing everything. But like it's not about any of that. Like just get the Lifetime movie ideas out of your head. That's not associated with this at all. The popular cultural narratives that we have of that glamorize the whole search and reunion experience. You can't do that with just a birth certificate. You can't. It's not possible to do that. And a lot of us have already had some parts of that information for most of our lives, whether it's a one or both birth parents' names, or knowing at least the accurate location of where we were born. The kinds of things that's on our birth certificates already. We've already known that through other sources.
Mary, do you have an Oklahoma adoption decree and amended birth certificate from New Jersey?
Yes, I have an Oklahoma adoption decree and an amended birth certificate from New Jersey. And I think that's when the law was getting updated in New Jersey I think it was 2017 was when it passed, or 2017 was when we were able to apply. That was when it went into effect. I think about the adopted people on the ground when that bill was going through. And I think that even though I wasn't adopted in Vermont and I wasn't born in Vermont, I think about all the Vermont adoptees who don't live in Vermont anymore.
Right.
And it's part of our, like, being people on the ground here. I think it's important for us to work toward open access for those adoptees who can't be here on the ground, who can't be caught up in this whirlwind because they don't even know about this hearing coming up, and being able to move so quickly. I think that's a way to be part of the extended adoptee community, to extend our service in the place where we're living, because adoptees move around all the time.
That's always the issue. I mean, as a constituent in Vermont, you have a more powerful voice than an adoptee from Vermont who's impacted by the bill. Yeah, so that's really well said. I mean, that's why we're so lucky to have Ellie involved. She's not only a Vermont adoptee, but she's a Vermont constituent, and that's the people and you guys have recognized that in your working group in recognizing that what she wants to happen in the state is really it's a lot to put on her shoulder, but is what really should happen. Defer to what the impacted adopted person thinks is best. Yeah.
Yeah. And I have to say too, that I think our working group has been so successful to this point, and I know it will continue to be a successful working group no matter what happens, fingers crossed, when this bill leaves committee and takes on a bigger life. We have been so helped by all of the resources you've pulled together, Greg, and all the ways that you've helped focus our strategy. Because when you were dealing with things like this, with open access and people who are not experts being allowed in the room to answer questions as though they are experts, it's really frustrating, and emotions can run really high. And it's not always easy. I mean, it's never easy to manage those emotions, set them to the side, and then focus on what's going to work and what's going to have impact, and to try to communicate in a calm, organized fashion that is going to actually influence the way people make decisions in these rooms. And that's the work, right? It's the work is educating and re-educating and then meeting new people and educating them again.
Right. Yeah, no, it's been really, really fun to watch it develop. Because I mean, you mentioned the resources that I bring, but that's just one side of the coin. And the other side is the testimony and the work that you do on the ground. I mean, you can't have one without the other. Part of that is the logistics or the infrastructure behind it too. And being able to have a website and emails and communication and materials. That's one side of the coin as well. But you can't do anything without people on the ground. You're done if you don't have people on the ground. I mean, serious, you are.
I think that the resources, though, also they give legitimacy, and I hate that word.
I know what you mean.
It's necessary because we're coming in to this committee, this legislative committee, saying, "Hey, we're adopted people, and we know we're the experts that you need, but you don't know that yet because you're talking to people who have credentials like adoption attorney and adoption facilitator and registry administrator, and I'm just some voter named Mary who may or may not be in your district. So do you really care what I have to say?" And it really makes a big difference when you can say, we're a coalition, here's our email, check out our website, we have the answers you're looking for.
Exactly. I think that's super important.
And the letterhead.
Yeah, I mean,
don't forget letterhead.
Seriously, it's very important. You look organized, and if it gets down to it, we have to produce materials that you can, if they're taking people at the Capitol to drop by, you can drop off really nice, organized materials. All that stuff makes a difference.
It makes a difference to the people on the ground too, because it takes having those resources and those materials takes some of the pressure of that labor away from kind of the rest of everything that I feel like there's so much to keep track of that having at least that part, like some of the more simple basic things, like here's the website, here's the Facebook page, here's the framework that
was the whole intention of trying to support coalition building, was to take that burden off the people who are doing the really hard work on the ground. Having that there's infrastructure people there behind you. It's
huge.
Yeah. And so, maybe we'll get involved with Massachusetts to try to get that bill done at some point too. I'm not even cautiously optimistic unfortunately, with the Massachusetts bill.
Really?
Yeah, there's just such a huge barrier there in the Senate president that will not let anything go. Yeah.
Oh, that sucks.
Yeah. So my hope there is that we can get a meeting with her somehow. And
wow.
Yeah. I mean, if you take Vermont as an example, they started out with these hearings that were just terrible, but unlike any other legislature, they had meeting after meeting in which they were hearing from people. They were considering the issues. They were carefully listening. And when you had that time and that ability to do that, that was what made the difference. And also the strong testimony. We didn't back down. We were very clear about what's needed. And you all address these false narratives really strongly too. Mary, I just want to say that I can't imagine being 10 years old, seeing your siblings being placed for adoption, knowing that there's two siblings left, and then you're adopted, and suddenly, with all that information that you have and what you've seen, you can't get your own original birth record until 2017. That's just crazy to me.
Yeah. It was really bizarre when I really thought about it. I know these people. Right. I knew at least both of my biological parents. I didn't have a lot of information about my birth father's family and what the whole story was there, but it was fascinating. And being in a unique position as a kinship adoptee, it's very tempting sometimes, not tempting, but it feels sometimes within the adoptee community that kinship adoptees are not real adoptees.
I don't buy that. Yeah.
But it's, it's an easy thing to push aside and say, oh, well, you don't have the same struggles. And I would agree that there are some things that, I always had some mysteries solved and some questions answered. But there's also this way within families where once adoption is on the table, it doesn't matter where you are or who you're getting adopted by. Once adoption is on the table as the best option, something has gone horribly wrong. And within my family, and I think in plenty of other kinship adoptee families, of other kinship adoptees I know, there's this real opportunity where the adults in the room use the children as a weapon to hurt the other people, the other parents or the other extended relatives. And so it's a different experience, but it has really galvanized me to support open records for everyone, because especially when you think about step-parent adoptees, you think about people who were adopted as older children, they still didn't have any consent. These were things that happened to them. They were moved around like furniture.
Right. I think that's really important to make that distinction about autonomy. Because, I know that some adoptees don't consider step-parent adoption as you're not one of us, but I've heard so many agonizing stories from step-parent adoptees about the severing of their relationship with either a father or a mother and not being able to regain that autonomy. And it's just, I think we're all adoptees, whether it's kinship adoption or it's step-parent adoption or it's just, regular intercountry adoption or domestic traditional adoption. I don't make any distinctions. It's all adoption because of what you just said. It's all about regaining that autonomy that was taken away from you. And that issue's across the board for everyone. Yeah. Ellie, any last words for you?
I don't think so.
That's totally legit.
Too many last words to get them in.
Right. Okay. Well, we'll keep working. Thanks, everybody. So Vermont is looking far better than it did a month ago. Other state bills are not faring as well. 2 equal rights bills in Florida recently died in committee, though it was not expected that they would get a hearing. Wisconsin's bills also died in committee after hearings. And discriminatory bills have also died in West Virginia, while Mississippi's third try for a bill also failed to get a hearing. That leaves Massachusetts as the only state with a viable current bill that is unrestricted, unless we see an amended bill this week in Vermont. And finally, Idaho and Kentucky have terrible discriminatory bills that use registry or intermediary systems and allow birth parent vetoes or redactions, and for the most part don't apply to adult adopted people fully until the year 2040. For a full list of the adoptee rights state level bills now active, go to adopteesunited.org/legislation. You'll also find more information on federal bills, as well as bills in Tennessee, Oklahoma, Minnesota, and South Carolina, plus a great little bill in Rhode Island that will expand its current unrestricted law to descendants of deceased adopted people. What Next is written and hosted by me, Gregory Luce, and is a production of Adoptees United, Inc., a national nonprofit charitable organization. Please follow, subscribe, and rate us wherever you get your podcasts, and support us with a tax-deductible donation at adopteesunited.org/donate. See you again soon.